Well, I invented Ethernet, and over the next 50 years, 100 other people invented Ethernet, and they all have earned some claim. So I'd like to say thank you to all the other Ethernet inventors. But as a result of being an Ethernet inventor, I'm a member of the Connectivity Society, and we meet quarterly. And we just had a meeting of the Connectivity Society, and it was very sad. It was a sad meeting because one of our members had died. The inventor of USB had died. And so we, the members of the society, became the pallbearers, and we carried his coffin across the street to the waiting grave. And we lowered the USB inventor's coffin into the grave, but it jammed. So we pulled the coffin out of the grave, and then we rotated it 180 degrees, and it went into the grave. That is connectivity humor. I don't hear a lot of laughing. In any case, connectivity is my hammer. There's an expression that says, if a hammer is your only tool, everything looks like a nail. So I want to warn you, connectivity is my hammer, and everything looks like a connectivity problem to me. And just to get it out of the way, connectivity is the apparatus for moving stuff from A to B. And that stuff might be energy, it might be mass, but it's typically among us connectivity guys, it's signals are carried. And I'm here to report that the most important new fact about the human condition is that we are now all suddenly connected. About 5 billion of us are connected, 2/3 of the human race, and we've all joined the network since October 29th, 1969, when the internet first started shipping packets. So the most important fact is we are now connected. We are suddenly connected. That is, having been connected since 69, that's pretty fast. And it's in fact the suddenness that has created some of the pathologies that I'll mention a little bit later. I'm here at this DKG conference because I have a hunch. And the hunch is that a mixture of connectivity and distributed knowledge graphs and blockchains and are converging. And it's an important convergence. And in particular, it's going to help us solve one of the biggest problems we have these days, namely truth. That is, all over the connectivity space, people are having trouble deciding what is true. Now, they've been deciding this for some time. Here are 4 networks: the ARPANET, the ALOA network, the Ethernet, the internet itself. Going back to 1960, in the 60s, all those networks have had a problem with truth. Now the value, as we just heard from Branimir, the value of a network grows pretty rapidly with the number of participants, as the square my law proposes. And that value has been pretty positive over the last 50 years. For example, 1980, we had 2 billion people living in extreme poverty. And after a short time, say 2015, we only had 700 million people living in extreme poverty. And that reduction in extreme poverty, that was the first reduction in the history. Going back to 1820, it had never gone down before. And then starting around 1980, poverty went down. Now we can argue, and I'm happy to argue, that that's a consequence of the internet. That is, as the internet spread around the world, 5 billion people, mostly video on cell phones, that this improved the productivity of their various economies and thereby reduced poverty. I hasten to emphasize that because I'm going to give you a list of the negative values of the connectivity very shortly. So there, in the growth of the internet over that time, there were a number of really surprising reversals that we can, and we can expect other reversals. And that's why I'm enumerating these. So for example, there was a Grotius law in the 50s where an IBM executive had a law that said that the cost of a supercomputer grew as the square root of its power. The consequence of Grotius' law was to recommend that computers be ever bigger, surrounded by dumb terminals. Herb Grotius was wrong, and Silicon Valley, as a consequence, thanks to Moore's law, managed to move Silicon Valley from Route 128 in Boston to Route 101 in Silicon Valley. And then there was Negroponte's law. Let's call it a switch. It was called the Negroponte switch, where Negroponte noticed that we were all expecting that as the internet grew, that the local distribution inside of buildings would be done on copper from AT&T, the old AT&T copper, and the long haul would be of the internet would be carried by microwave. And Professor Negroponte noticed that that's not how it was playing out. In fact, the reverse occurred. The internet today, the local distribution within buildings is now done wirelessly, and the long haul is done with cables, principally fiber optic cables. That was a surprising switch. And finally, there's Cooper's law, another switch. Marconi has spent his life and won a Nobel Prize getting radio to go further and further and further. But since about 1905, Cooper, the inventor of the cell phone, Marty Cooper explains with his law that all the traffic in radio since then has been by having radio go shorter and shorter distances with smaller and smaller cells. So that was another big surprising. So there are huge surprises in the evolution of connectivity, and we can expect more of them as we put connectivity under DKGs. Now, a consequence of all this connectivity coming up so suddenly since 1969 are some pathologies. The first pathology was hacking. In December of 1973, 2 high school students hacked the internet. So hacking has been going on for some time. The next pathology of the internet was pornography. The United States government almost shut down the internet because it was so good at carrying pornography. And then they passed a law called the Communications Decency Act. So now, of course, there's no more porno on the internet. The next surprising pathology was advertising. Those of us who built the internet to connect the world were offended that people were advertising over the internet. But in very short order, we learned that advertising would fund the development and operation of the internet, which it does to this day. And we have a bunch of new pathologies now. We have polarization, loneliness, and fake news. Now, fake news is one of those pathologies that asks the question, what is true? How do you know what's fake and what's not fake? And that is not a solved problem. We're in the midst of solving. Now, we've solved the previous pathologies. We're going to solve this one too. But at the moment, what is true is the question of the hour. And this is where the DKGs come in. The DKG comes in to feed truth to the AIs that we're putting on top of the DKGs. Let me just leave you with end these short remarks with a paradox. I call it the transistor neuron paradox, and it's a connectivity paradox. Neurons are pathetic. They're huge and they're slow. Transistors are wonderful. They're down at 5 nanometers now, and they're switching in the billions of cycles per second. But even though transistors are much more impressive compared to neurons, neurons win hand down. human brains are much smarter than the computers that we build with our transistors. So why is it that computers are not as smart as people, even though they're built out of the superior devices called transistors? And there is an answer. And the answer to that question is connectivity. The difference between computers and brains is the brains are much more highly connected. If you look at the GPTs have what's called parameters, which are analogous to the synaptic connections in the human brain. And GPT-2 had 1.5 billion parameters. GPT-3 had 175 billion parameters. And everyone's guessing what GPT-4 has. Guesses range from 1 to 100 trillion parameters, a lot of connectivity. So let's assume the GPT-4 is going to get 100 trillion parameters or connections. That's 10 to the trillion is 10 to the 12 times 100 is 10 to the 14. So that's a hell of a lot of connectivity in the GPT-4. But the brain has 10 to the 11th neurons, each of which has 10 to the 4th on average synapses. So that's 10 to the 4th times 10 to the 11th, 10 to the 15th. 10 to the 15th is 10 times bigger than 10 to the 14th. So if you just look at the connectivity of the brain, the GPT is still a factor of 10 to go, even given it's 100 trillion connectivity. So connectivity, I'm arguing, is very important. And in designing our various systems, like supply chains, like construction, monitoring, like transportation, we should start with connectivity. And if we do, we'll end up better off. So let me end there. Branimir, you might have some questions you'd like to ask.